So maybe evil in the world doesn't prove that it's impossible for God to exist, but at least it makes it less probable, right? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. We've been considering the logical problem of evil, which says that it's impossible for God to exist because there are no reasons that God could possibly have for allowing evil to exist. Now, we've also seen some possible reasons, and there's a pretty good consensus amongst philosophers, both theists and atheists, that at least some of those reasons are successful reasons. And if that's the case, then the logical problem of evil fails. And sure enough, a lot of people think that it does. But what if we were just setting our sights too high? What if our goals were just a little too lofty? What if instead of proving that God's existence is impossible because of evil, we just say that it's less probable or even improbable? Well, consider the following thought experiment. Let's pretend like you and I are there at the beginning of the universe. We're outside observers, of course, and we're sitting there and we're eating our popcorn and we're excitedly talking about what we think is going to happen. Now, I'm operating off of what we'll call the hypothesis of indifference, which says that what's about to happen, the universe being created, is the result of indifferent forces. There's no intelligent being that's bringing these things about. You, on the other hand, are operating from the hypothesis of theism, which says that there is a God, a benevolent, all-knowing, all-powerful being that is creating all of this stuff. Now, of course, neither one of us believe in something that we can actually see. Both the indifferent forces and God would be invisible things. So how do we tell who is right when we see the universe get going here? Well, one thing we could do is sort of borrow a page from the playbook of science and make predictions about what we think would happen. And what would our predictions look like? Well, for me, being the indifferent forces guy, I would probably predict that there would be evil in the world. I'd predict, there would be earthquakes and famines and smooth jazz and all kinds of horrific evils. You, on the other hand, would likely predict that there would be nothing but puppy dogs and ice cream, right? That there would be like a Candyland situation. There's a benevolent God that's making all of this stuff. Of course, he's going to make things all nice and pretty for us. So we look and we see the world start to unfold, and lo and behold, evil appears. What does that mean? It seems like it means that my hypothesis is more probable than your hypothesis, or at the very least that it gives credence to my hypothesis over your hypothesis. Now, of course, we can't actually go back to the beginning of the universe and do this. We can't witness the whole thing happening, and even if we could, then we wouldn't really be making predictions at that point. We would already know what's going to happen. But some philosophers have given this as a thought experiment to show that how the existence of evil should make it less probable, or give less credence to theism and more credence to atheism, to the idea that God doesn't exist, that the universe is just constructed from indifferent forces. And that would be the argument known as the probabilistic problem of evil. So we talked about the logical problem of evil before. That's it's impossible for God to exist if evil exists. This is the probabilistic one, where it's just less probable. It looks something like this. The hypothesis of indifference predicts that there will be evil in the world. The hypothesis of theism predicts that there will not be evil in the world, or we can call the state of affairs where evil obtains E. So hypothesis I, indifferent forces, predicts E would obtain, and hypothesis T, theism, would predict that it doesn't obtain. Now, pretend they start off with equal prior probability. We don't know what the heck's going to go on, so we're looking at this happening, and neither one of them are more probable than the other. Well, E obtains. That should mean that my hypothesis of indifference is more probable than your hypothesis of theism. Of course, it should also be noted that the hypothesis of indifference isn't quite atheism. All it's claiming is that God did not create the universe. It's not claiming that God didn't exist, but yeah, it's close enough. So for right now, let's just count it as atheism. So if we assume that the hypothesis of indifference is pretty much equivalent to atheism, then if it's the case that evil exists in the world, this argument claims, and it should be the case, that atheism is more probable than theism, even if it's not impossible for theism to be true. And that's all well and good until we consider the view called skeptical theism that we saw in, I think, a video like maybe last video, maybe a couple videos ago. Skeptical theism pointed out that if God is an infinite intellect, and if we are finite intellects, then it would necessarily be the case that God would have reasons for doing things that we could not reason our way to, right? We couldn't use just logic and figure out, what God would do in certain situations. So if that's the case, then God would have necessarily reasons for allowing evils in this world that we just wouldn't be able to figure out on our own. So thinking about that then, what if there were a skeptical theist who was there with the hypothesis of indifference person? What would he predict? Well, notice that he would not predict that there would be no evil in the world. What he would do is say, well, I don't know. I mean, I know that God's going to have these incredible reasons for whatever. He's going to do something, and I'm not totally sure what it's going to be. Sure enough, he could allow evil in this world. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know. Both of those things are possibilities. So now notice, it's no longer the case that the theist is predicting not E, that evil will not obtain. Instead, the theist is predicting possibly E, possibly not E. The theist is open to both. So that's going to, do some damage to this probabilistic problem of evil, but maybe we could salvage it. Maybe we could change it up just a little bit. And here's probably the strongest way. So again, the hypothesis of indifference predicts that there will be evil things that happen. The hypothesis of, we'll call it hypothesis S, hypothesis of skeptical theism, will not predict E or not E. So what does that mean? Well, if E obtains, that should be considered evidence for a hypothesis of indifference, hypothesis I. If evil does not obtain, that should be considered evidence against hypothesis I. But whether or not evil obtains, hypothesis S should not get more or less probable, right? It's sort of like not going to play this game at all, so it doesn't get any of the rewards, but it also doesn't get any of the punishments. So given that scenario, E obtains, that is going to give credence to hypothesis I just like it did before, but skeptical theism is not going to change at all. It's not going to reap that reward, reap that benefit. But now, if we're going to assume that hypotheses I and S both have equal prior probability, then it seems like the skeptical theist's hypothesis is still at base level, whereas the hypothesis of indifference guy is, he's got a legit prediction that has come true. Seems like he's way increased in his probability that he's right. So maybe we could say we still have it to be the case, even if skeptical theism is true, that evil existing in the world makes it more probable for atheism to be true, for God not to exist. Before we actually evaluate this argument, I think it's important to know exactly what's at stake here. So, in the logical problem of evil, the goal was to show that God's existence was impossible. And if that argument were successful, then it wouldn't matter what else we did. It wouldn't matter what other arguments that we came up with for or against God's existence. It just would be impossible. So, there's nothing else we could say. There are also arguments for God's existence that are like that are meant to show that necessarily God exists. And if those are successful, then this argument, the probabilistic problem of evil, would be meaningless. There would be no point, because we would have already shown that for sure God exists. But this is just a probabilistic problem of evil. So what that means is it's meant to increase the probability that God doesn't exist. And since there are really only two major arguments against the existence of God. Well, actually, really, there are two arguments that are put forth often One is that science is going to explain everything, check is in the mail, so we don't need to posit God's existence. But that's really an argument against belief in God, not that God doesn't exist, not showing that God can't exist. This is really the one that is meant to show that God can't exist. So if this argument is successful, then what that means is we'll have to then go to the arguments for the existence of God. If any of them increase the probability that God exists, then ultimately we're going to have to weigh out and see which one of these is more successful. All those arguments together, and there's like some 30-some arguments for the existence of God, some of which are for sure probabilistic, like the teleological argument, which we'll talk about very soon. We'll have to combine all those probabilistic arguments and weigh the two out and see which one comes out on top, and then we'll be able to make the decision on which one is more probable. So that's important to take note of, is that right now we're considering the probabilistic problem of evil in isolation. We're not considering any other arguments for the existence of God. And that's important because if we consider premise 3 here that says that both these theories have equal prior probability, well, when we consider these other arguments, they won't have equal probability. We're going to have to also take those into consideration. So the conclusion that the hypothesis of indifference is more probable than the hypothesis of skeptical theism, it isn't really a legit conclusion just yet. It really should be a conclusion more like assuming that nothing else comes along, but not necessary. We'll just consider this for right now and keep in the back of our heads that job isn't done here afterwards. So now let's consider the argument and see if it's successful against skeptical theism. And I don't think it is. First of all, because I think it is not the right view of probability assignment, of credence assignment, really. So it argues that, we have two hypotheses, and one of them makes this prediction, and if the prediction comes true, it should get more credence. The other one doesn't make any prediction, so if that prediction comes true, it doesn't get any benefit. And that's the idea. And it sounds legit when you hear it like that. But then again, if you think about it, these two hypotheses are both explaining the same data set, and they are both mutually exclusive. So that means that when you assign more probability to one, that decreases the probability of the other, when that other one was saying that this state of affairs E was an absolute possibility. It was within the range of things that it was. So in a way, like skeptical theism does predict E, but it really predicts like a range of possibilities with E involved there. And it shouldn't be the case that E obtaining decreases the probability of skeptical theism. A way to see this is, let's say we're outside of a bakery and two bakers are going in, and we know that there's only one oven in this bakery, so we know only one of them is going to get a chance to bake first. The first baker is named Indigo. The second one is named Skip, and that'll stand for theory I and theory S. And somebody bakes something, and out comes a box of pastries, and we're not sure what it is, but here it is. And you and I say, look at this, the baked goods have come out. Now let's say we were talking and I tell you, hey, I bet you it was Indigo. I bet you Indigo got there first. And you say, no, I bet you it was Skip that got there first. Oh yeah? How are we going to tell who got there first? Well, one thing we could do is think about what these bakers like to bake. And I say, hey, you know what? I know Indigo loves eclairs, always makes eclairs. That's Indigo's thing. I bet you there's eclairs in that box. And you say, well, yeah, okay, but Skip also makes eclairs, right? Skip makes all kinds of stuff. He makes eclairs and donuts and I don't know what other pastries that you can think of. Strudels. He makes the strudel and he makes everything. So yeah, if there are eclairs in there, then that's definitely something Skip could do. I open the box and sure enough, there are eclairs. Does that count as evidence for me? Does that count as giving more credence to my theory that it was Indigo? No, I don't think so, because then that would mean it was less likely that Skip made those those eclairs, but eclairs are something that Skip makes. Right? That's one of your things is that, yes, Skip absolutely makes eclairs. He just makes other things. So I don't know. I mean, so I think in that way, it would be wrong to assign more probability to the hypothesis I just because it's one predicted state of affairs comes true, when hypothesis S also predicted that as at least within the range of things that are potential for it. I also think that this scenario, this thought experiment of the hypothesis I and the hypothesis S person standing at the beginning of the universe actually proves the opposite of what it's intended to prove. And here's what I mean. Again, think about that scenario. You and I are at the beginning of the universe. I'm the hypothesis of indifference person. Am I really going to predict that there's going to be suffering in the world? Am I really going to predict that, there are going to be people who have bad things happen to them? I don't really think so, because there's no way I would predict that there would be people in the first place. If I thought the world was about to come about due to indifferent forces, then I wouldn't predict that, hey, I bet you like all this stuff is going to congeal into these stars and planets. And on one of those planets, I bet you there's going to be like self-moving things, living things. And those living things are going to eventually become intelligent living things. And those intelligent living things, I bet they're going to build skyscrapers and shopping malls and all kinds of stuff. Now, I wouldn't say that, right? What I would predict if I thought the universe was coming about due to indifferent forces is that there is going to be utter chaos. I would predict just an explosion and stuff going everywhere. That's all I'd predict. I wouldn't predict any kind of actual suffering, because I wouldn't predict any kind of people. You, on the other hand, I said that you would predict that there would be this range of, possibilities of evil and some with not evil. But at the very least, you're going to predict some kind of intelligible order, right? I mean, it's going to be very unlikely that this benevolent, all-knowing, all-powerful God is just going to like sneeze out something. He's going to probably do something. So you're going to predict some kind of intelligible order in the universe. I'm going to predict utter chaos. Now, run the argument again. And instead of E, let's throw in an O for order. The hypothesis of indifference person is going to predict not O, not order. The state of affairs of order is not going to obtain. Now, if O obtains, that should count as evidence against the hypothesis of a indifference person. O does in fact obtain, so that should be evidence against the hypothesis of indifference. Now, you might hear that and think, wait, isn't this guy cheating? Didn't he just say that the skeptical theist doesn't have that count against him if evil does obtain? And yet here we're saying that the order doesn't obtain, and it does count against the hypothesis of indifference person. That sounds like you're arguing out of both sides of your mouth. I don't even know what that means, by the way, but it seems like double standard, right? That's what I mean. So, not quite. And here's why. I don't think that the two situations are similar, because the hypothesis of indifference person was positing that E would happen. The skeptical theist wasn't just abstaining from any kind of prediction whatsoever. The skeptical theist was allowing for two possibilities, was positively arguing, here is the range of possible things, both evil and not evil. These are two live options for God to do. So the reason that it didn't count against the skeptical theist is because, in a way, both of those two theories were successful. They both predicted something, this state of E. It's just that the skeptical theist also had other possibilities there that could have been successful. Now, in this case, there isn't the case of two successful theories. There's the failure of hypothesis of indifference. And so if the skeptical theist is allowing for, a couple of possibilities, and the hypothesis of indifference person is failing at his prediction, then it should count as evidence against the hypothesis of indifference person. And What's worse is it's not even the case that the skeptical theist is leaving things up in the air here. Really, we should change this argument even further to say not only is the hypothesis I predicting not O, it's not the case that the skeptical theist is predicting either O or not O. The skeptical theist is predicting O, that there will be some kind of order. So there's going to be a successful prediction for the skeptical theist, an unsuccessful prediction for the hypothesis of indifference person. Also, just to be clear, it's not the case that we could look at this as, well, okay, the indifference person, the hypothesis I person, was successful in the prediction of E, but was not successful in the prediction of not O. Because remember, again, like I said, the indifference person would not predict E. The indifference person would say there's not going to be order, so there's not going to be evil in the world either, because there's not going to be anything. There's not going to be stuff to suffer. There's just going to be a mass chaos. So, again, I think that really this probabilistic problem of evil, this style of arguing, proves the opposite of what it intends to when we think about what should be predicted by both sides. Now, there is one possible response that I can think of to this, however, and it's this. Okay, indifferent forces, yes, but one of those indifferent forces is natural selection. One of those indifferent forces is this sort of like self-organizing force that will put things together. Now, with that self-organizing force, at the beginning of the universe, aren't I going to predict that there's going to be some kind of, evolution of species that maybe even gets to the level of intellect, but at the very least could have bad things happen to it? Yeah, I think that would be the case if you knew that there was going to be this self-organizing principle. Then sure, that's what you would predict. The only problem is that that's not predicting, right? That's not a prediction at all. If you were to know ahead of time the way things are going to turn out, and then you rewind the tape to the original causes, you don't get to say that you were predicting what's going to happen, because you already know what's going to happen. In fact, it reminds me of this game I used to play a long time ago. I used to teach little guys Spanish, 1st through 5th grade. And it was a super fun job. I loved to teach these little guys. It was, oh man, it was so fun. I love philosophy. That's really my passion. But yeah, the 1st through 5th grade Spanish was fun. And I used to love to play this game with the 1st graders. They had these little all about me posters, and it would say like, my favorite animal is a tiger, my favorite color is purple, my favorite food is peanut butter jelly. And I would read it, and I'd go into the classroom and I would say, you look like a tiger person. Do you like tigers? Yeah, you do like tigers, huh? Are you a purple person? I knew it, right? A purple person. And what purple person doesn't love peanut butter and jelly? Am I right, folks? And, you'd see these huge eyes. Like, how did he guess? Well, I didn't guess. I knew. You know what I mean? I already knew the results. So going backwards and saying that I'm predicting is not really predicting. In the same way here, a person that already knows what's going to happen can't go then back and say, yeah, well, let's just pretend my hypothesis is indifferent forces, but the forces are such. There's the strong, weak, and there's the electromagnetic and gravity forces. And I also am hypothesizing that the world's going to explode in such a way. And I'm also of course you would get that all right if you already knew ahead of time. And if you think about it, the skeptical theist could do the very same thing. He could say, well, I would predict a world in which God would create humans. Why? Because I think God would be that kind of God. That's my hypothesis, is that not only that the universe is going to be the result of God acting, but that God is such that he would create human beings. Of course, you already know that happens, but I don't know. God could have created a universe without human beings and just cool stuff in it. There's no impossibility there, in the same way that there would be no impossibility of indifferent forces not being self-organizing. So, in other words, I don't think that response works, because we've left the realm of prediction. We've left the realm of not knowing what's going to happen and then being right about it. And that's really where the crux of the probability increase comes from. It's being successful in prediction. So if we're not having any predictions, then there's nothing to be successful about. In any case, that is the probabilistic problem of evil. If you got any questions on that, again, please hit me up in the comments. I'd love to answer any of them. And that's all I got. I'll see you in the next video. Adios.